big pleasure to welcome Gabriel Fairman to today. So he's the founder and CEO of BureauWorks and one of the most interesting thinkers in the language industry here today. So Gabriel is going to speak about the age of agentic translation. Agentic translation is actually what I ended the most recent remote presentation with on my side. So this is a very, very interesting topic. Gabriel, you obviously with BureauWorks, a cloud-based and super flexible translation management system combines the benefits of AI in a secure, predictable, and enterprise-grade framework and platform. So tell us more about what is agentic translation. Take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Florian, for the intro. And it's going to be hard to live up to how you presented me, but I'm going to try and do my best with the next few minutes to really make it worth everybody's while. Every time I present, I make it a point to make it the best possible presentation of the day. And I'm not a big fan of buzzwords, but agentic translation is definitely one of them, and I'm using it flat out. But I'll explain why I'm using it, how it's contextualized in what we're doing, and hopefully everybody can have a great time. And please, if you have any comments, questions throughout, we'll set some time at the end to answer them, but please keep them flowing. I may be able to see them, and I may pause and get to them also during the presentation. All right, so we say this a lot at BureauWorks. We're in a journey from text to wisdom. And this can mean different things to different people. So let me explain what we mean by it. So when we talk about data, we're talking about scattered information, right? So if we think about the context of, like, say, map navigation, which is a good analogy here, data would be, let's say, a bunch of street names and addresses, numbers, highways, completely scattered, completely unorganized. That's data, right? It's just raw data. When we talk about information, now that would be that information somehow cataloged, right? So think about a phone book, right? That's a very good example of information. You have the name and the address and the phone of that respective person. That's organized maybe in alphabetical order. That's information. If we go back to the map example, information now may be actually the streets actually all configured, and you can see what flows into the next street and where you make a left would be a map, right? A map would be the information all gathered together. When we talk about knowledge, that's what we see currently in most advanced navigation apps we have available. So for instance, you type in a destination and you have the knowledge of exactly, let's say, maybe it would take an hour and a half to go there. Maybe you're trying to go to the beach with your family, and it would typically take an hour and a half, but it's Saturday morning, everybody's trying to go there too, and now you know that it's going to take you 2 hours. You may also know exactly where the bottlenecks in the roads are. So that's knowledge, right? That's when you gather, it's another dimension of all of that information of the maps. When we talk about wisdom, I asked that ironically if it's compatible with humans, because I honestly don't know. But wisdom would be yet another dimension of knowledge. So for instance, it's not anymore the question of whether or not it's going to take you an hour and a half or 2 hours and a half due to traffic. But now the question is it a good idea to go to the beach? You know, is maybe one of your kids wasn't feeling that good all throughout the week, and maybe you feel like they're going to get a flu or something, and it's better to stay home. Maybe everybody's going to that beach that weekend because it's going to be, and maybe it's just going to be crowded. Maybe you feel like you just would be better off cooking a nice meal at home, right? So that's wisdom, right? Wisdom would be the ability to make something out of all of those decisions. Now, when we take all of this back to where we are, in at least my understanding of where we are as a translation and localization space, we believe at BureauWorks we're getting very close to level 3. In my opinion, we're still operating as in the paradigm of level 2 information. If you think about translation memories, that's exactly like a phone book, right? Or a glossary. That's exactly like a phone book. You have a reference, like a source and a target, and same thing, right? The name, telephone. Same thing with a glossary. And these are very static forms, very static and very structured ways of keeping information. And there's a reason why we've been in this number 2 era of information for so long, particularly in our space. Like, think about analogously, right? In most, if we think about navigation, for instance, we're already way, way, way into knowledge for many years now. I mean, most navigation apps have been around for at least 10 years with very precise measurements of traffic and satellite data and all kinds of things. Whereas in our space, we're still operating, as much as machine translation has gotten better, in general, the paradigm is you have information that's structured in the form of translation memories, glossaries, or machine translation. Still, it's the phone book paradigm. And we did it because we had to enable globalization, right? Localization isn't just like something that came up randomly. There was immense economic pressure to get content across to all kinds of countries and demographics in the shortest amount of time possible. And to do that, we had to make it scalable, manageable, and affordable, right? And prior to information technology and everything that was developed in the past 40 years in our space, it was unfeasible to do that, right? So our work really revolved around mechanizing and commoditizing language, right? So when we think about that, we're looking at, for instance, reducing language to its core components like syntax and segments and creating blue scores and thinking about repetition. So it's like boxing everything up, creating a supply chain. And that was beautiful in many ways. I mean, that's what enabled this this initial large push towards globalization that we've seen over the past 40 years, right? All of these little boxes, they allowed us to have a lot of structure. But the problem is that these little boxes, they also distance us from what language is really about. So the language in this commoditized and mechanized way becomes denaturalized, becomes depersonalized, becomes transactionalized, decontextualized. So it's a lot of the problems that we then have to try to solve as an industry, right? How do we address translations that really resonate with people? How do we address translations that really connect with people, that really get people to perform certain outcomes? And we develop all kinds of solutions like transcreation and a shortage of talent, but it's a problem that we've created to solve something else, right? And the thing that we believe in, or I believe in very personally, is that language is about identity. It's about creating a very strong sense of connection with particular groups of people that you identify with. And I want to put that out there because even though this may seem obvious, for lots of people, language is more about communication. And it is about that too. But in my opinion, language is very primarily about identity. And it's also very primarily about outcomes. So getting people to buy something, share something, like something. And there's a conversation that I've been having recently that we're currently sitting in a place that for me is very synchronistic and actually crazy, which is I'm finding I come from a more of a philosophy background, so that's what I majored in, and I majored particularly focused around the production of meaning. And what's interesting is that for the transition that we went through in philosophy is very similar to the transition that we were going through now in our industry. So in philosophy, you went from having, let's say, structuralists, people like Ferdinand Saussure, who really believed in the idea of signifier and signified, that language was about representing the world. And a lot of that commoditization and mechanization that we see in language is still about this idea that language represents the world. Now, when you look at the people who succeeded this school of thought, people like Ludwig Wittgenstein, for instance, they proposed that language was about getting things done, that the chair didn't represent the chair because it was just pointing to the idea of a chair. The chair was a chair because somebody needed to tell someone where to sit at. So they needed something to call it for, to get that action to happen, right? So this is a very important concept. Language isn't about just representing things. Language is about getting people to do certain things like buying, sharing, liking, commenting, understanding, etc. And this is huge, right? Because this is much harder to manage than this signifier signified paradigm, right? In a signifier signified paradigm, it's very easy to say if something is right or wrong, right? If the sentence says the chair is on the table and the translation says the chair is under the table, then it's not saying the same thing, right? It's very simple. But if we're analyzing outcomes and maybe that second sentence gets someone to click where I want them to click, who is to say that the translation is incorrect if I'm getting that correct outcome? And again, it's a provocation, but it's a different way of looking at things. And what's particularly interesting about our moment in time is that mechanization used to be in direct opposition with humanization. So what I'm saying about this is like the more we transactionalized language, the less human it became. If you ask any translator their experience in a cat tool, for instance, way less human than, for instance, writing something out or typing something out. They're boxed into these segments and they feel constrained and they have to work with all kinds of like alerts and this complicated workbench. It's very, and they're typically also working very distant from their end users. I mean, if you think about it, most of the translation volume flows through large agencies who then often hire smaller agencies who then hire the translators who are very removed from the whole production chain. And it creates this decontextualization. And so far, that's been the thread. And now all of a sudden, we're opening a door where this technology can actually be used to really further humanize things in a way that we have never seen before. So when we look at how I see tech currently dividing in our space, we have a first bifurcation, which is to me very clear. You have people investing very much in a perfect black box. These are models that are, the idea is that you give them an input, they're going to give you an output. Doesn't really matter how it got there, but it's going to give you a very precise output, right? And you see a ton of companies heading in this direction. It's like output precision. And then there's a bifurcation, which is all about human managed outputs. And that's typically what translation management systems are all about. And then there's this more subtle bifurcation below that I see, that is, one is about having humans in the loop, right? So it's about still working maybe within that paradigm where humans are validating and they're looking at information, but they're looking at maybe it more passively, in my opinion. And where we're trying to go is what we believe in, is that humans who own outcomes. And this ownership of outcomes is, in my opinion, a very transformative aspect of what we're talking about. So, and in order to own outcomes, you have to have visibility and you have to have clarity and contextualization that wasn't ever possible before with what we currently have, with the technology that was available then, right? And now we're talking about large language models and we're talking about what they enable. And I want to just very briefly touch on the difference between an assistant and an agent and why we're using this terminology. So an assistant, the simplest way, and again, maybe I'm oversimplifying. If I am, please forgive me for this. But for me, an assistant, the simplest way to understand an assistant is that it's user initiated. So it's very similar to if you type in something into ChatGPT and you ask it to do something, it's working as your assistant. In the case of BureauWorks, maybe you're asking BureauWorks to fix a tag or to proofread something. It's a user-initiated action. It gets you that response. But the fact is, like, you're relying on the technology as your assistant, right? Now, compared to an agent, the agent is very different, in my opinion, in the sense that it's running in the background. It's not necessarily user-initiated. It has its own agenda, let's say. And these agents could be multiple. Like, for instance, here is an example of our learning terms agent, which is consistently learning and extracting and aligning the terminology that's used in runtimes, right? So that's the example of an agent. It's running in the background. You don't have to prompt it. You don't have to ask for it. If you have it turned on, it's going to be learning and extracting your terminology as you move on. Another example of an agent is our smells. So smells is a semantic runtime verifier. It's also running in the background, and it's looking for instance, for translation consistency issues, at missing prepositions or incompleteness. It's looking at cultural misappropriations, gender bias. It's looking at a very wide range of potential issues with the translation, and it's flagging those to the translator, right? So this is an example of a semantic verification agent. But the opportunities for agents are quite limitless. And the agents, they open the door to a whole new level of writing, right? And I'm not using the idea of translation here because deliberately, because in my opinion, we're going to get very soon. I do believe when people say that, for instance, translations will be a solved problem, or that large language models will be 99% as accurate as the top 1% of human translators, I can buy those claims. I mean, I don't know if they're going to be if they're real or not, but I can accept those hypotheses of what the world will look like. But I don't think that's the end of anything. I think that's the beginning. And that's why I'm framing things as the question of writing, right? Because for so many years, the challenge was just getting the content available in a certain language. That was just a huge challenge. That challenge is becoming smaller, but then other challenges open up. And not just these new challenges open up, but now we have new tools, particularly in terms of insights, right? These insights, they open the door to a whole new level of writing, because now I'm not just writing from the perspective of my head. The agents, they allow me to see many different things that previously I wouldn't be able to see. So here's an example of an agent that we call sous chef in BureauWorks. And this agent, it allows you to create hundreds of variants per content type. And that's something pretty powerful in the sense that previously, maybe you had, let's say, a situation where you had to have only a single copy of the target per every source. That's typically where we were for all these years, where it's very difficult to sustain maybe 5 or 6 different versions of the same target for different demographics. Maybe you want to target for people moving on the bus. Maybe you want to target for people that have just completed their middle school education. Maybe you want to target for people who are particularly sophisticated with their language. Very difficult to manage that in the past. We're at a point where now that's possible. So we're talking about a much greater level of personalization with language. We can think about not just source to target, but source to persona. That's a very different kind of way of thinking about localization, right? So by doing source to persona, that even changes the idea of even the English copy itself, because for so long it's been very difficult to manage multiple different copies. So yeah, sure, you can A/B test. That means A/B, you're going to have 1, 2, maybe 3, 4 different variants of a certain style or a different copy. But it's complicated for us to imagine like a single website running, for instance, with hundreds of different variants. Now we're talking about a world where that's possible, where we're talking about content that's very finely tuned to the way in which a reader approaches that text. And that's a level of optimization that typically we just wasn't attainable with the tech that we had. So the opportunity that we have here with this kind of tech framework is that we can link textual decisions to outcomes, right? And this is a huge departure. So going back to that idea that I was talking back from the philosophy thing, this idea of signifier and signified, and this idea, all of our framework around quality is about, fundamentally, is about how well does it communicate what the source is trying to say. And it's been a linguistic thing, right? Quality has been fundamentally a linguistic thing. If you look at like all of these LQA structures that have been created throughout the decades of localization, they're all fundamentally linguistically. What we're talking about now is changing the idea of quality to actually efficiency in outcome delivery. So let's say, rather than discussing, and I'm not saying that linguistic quality doesn't exist, it still exists, but in my opinion, it's not as important as the outcome. So maybe we can debate for hours of whether or not the copy that we're using on our website is good or bad. But if I can prove to you that the copy that we're using is 76% more effective than the copy that you're proposing, then I don't think we actually have a debate. I mean, I think that number itself delivers the idea that we're able to the outcome based on what we're trying, based on the copy that's being used. And now, because we have so much data around analytics and around any digital content, whether it's the number of shares, reposts, etc., we have so much that we can draw from a data perspective that it really allows us to establish correlations that we've never been able to establish previously, and go into a whole other idea of whether or not the content is engaging correctly with the right people in the right way. Are they hitting the buy button? Are they converting? Are they spending more time on the page, right? Is the language that's being used generating the outcome that we're looking for, right? That's the most important question, in my opinion, when we talk about enterprise grade localization. And when we talk about agents, they are the ones who help the authors achieve outcomes, right? And again, I'm not using the word translators deliberately here. I'm using authors, because that's the world that we're going into. Now, again, in my opinion, the whole concept of translation, yes, maybe that's going to be figured out, but there's going to be a whole lot for us to do in our space, and it's going to be around managing authorship, right? So in this example, for instance, that we've produced out of Bureau Works, for instance, think about looking at our headline, in Chinese being translated into English, and we're looking at more than the translation management system as a suggested translation. Think about the translator having all kinds of different inputs, being able to produce, being able to look at literary insights, at brand terminology, at keyword search volumes, at tone and style of recommendations, at potential issues around the style of the copy, not based on errors, but based on just maybe a little bit too much vagueness, or a little bit more concreteness would appeal to better to different level of demographics. We're talking about a translator who's being, well, I'm using the word translator, but an author who's being aided in ways that just weren't previously possible, right? And with all this information, with all of these insights, the potential of ownership is huge, but the challenge is also a lot different, right? Now the challenge isn't about getting information from A to B, right? Now the challenge isn't translating more than the translation management system. Now the challenge is finding the right copy for the right reader. Now the challenge is finding the right composition that's going to make people spend more time on page, not just in the English version, but in all of the versions. And we're talking about unlocking so many more. That's definitely something that we believe is going to be a trend. We're going to be seeing so much more content being translated. We're going to see so many more languages being translated into, because accessibility is going to become a huge thing. And we're going to see the requirements for what is considered good copy to continuously increase as well. Why? Because we're going to have more data around it, and it's going to be more competitive, and people are going to be competing more and more for other people's attentions, and there's going to be more and more content. So it's going to be a huge challenge to get that edge, right? And this augmentation bit, these agents are what are going to allow us to get there. So again, the key thing I want to put out there is that it's not about what the humans can ask the machine to do, right? Again, the reactive assistant, right? Because that's coming from the human, so it's relying on the human framework. But think about the insights that the machine can produce that are completely beyond human ability, and then what our sense of authorship can produce with that, right? So it's like being flagged with knowledge that's completely beyond of my own ability to think, conceive of. But then my role is to, how do I crunch this stuff together? How do I make sense of the brand, of the reader, of the product, of the challenges we had in the past, of opportunities that we see in the future? My role becomes that of an author, someone who's incredibly well fed with information and who can think about where they want to take things in the future. And this again opens the door to really iterate on return on investment, not based on hypothetical scenarios, again, of whether, we improved the ROI because if we didn't localize into this language, we wouldn't have sold X million dollars, for instance. No, we're talking about actually being able to show, okay, this style, this copy produced so much better CTRs and scores, etc., than that copy. And we can also show those deltas in general, and then prove value in a way that goes so far beyond just the idea of getting something available in the language, but also getting into the space of the best possible version of each given content for each possible reader, right? So it fractalizes in an incredible way. So the key thing, if I want to leave something with everybody today, is that in my opinion, it's understanding that the translation itself is just the very beginning, the very starting point towards a journey of endless connections and results, right? So I'm not too worried about the fact that we're going to figure out translation. I'm pretty confident that technology will take care of that. But I'm still very optimistic and hopeful about the space that we're going to carve out that's going to be all about managing those connections and those results. And we're going to need the brilliance of people and a lot of amazing tools to be able to achieve that. So that's the presentation. Thank you so much, everybody, for giving me your time. And thank you, Florian, for the space. And here we are.
Thanks so much for this. This is, as always, super thought-provoking. So let me get started with a couple of questions here that we have from the audience. So Julia is asking, and it's good that we have this feature that we can just kind of put that in. Journalism major, love the idea of coming back full circle to writing. I mean, personally, my feeling has always been translation is a lot about writing. You are writing this, and if you're a great translator, you're rewriting a lot of it. This is where it starts. Question: how trustworthy are the agents? How do we check for inherent bias of training models for those agents, and how does it get checked on the cultural norms and linguistic slang levels, etc.?
So yeah, that's the beauty of human verifying outputs, right? The idea is that the agent isn't, at least in our paradigm, the agent isn't making a decision. The agent is making recommendations, and it's providing insights. Whether or not those insights are worthy or unworthy, that's up to the human to decide. And based on their decisions, those feedback loops are continuously updated. So again, I think this is my personal opinion, but I think a lot of people get caught up in the idea of reliability, and we do focus on, I think about it more as consistency, because the reliability is produced in the interactions between the humans and these agents. But it's a great question. I just think that in general, because we're relying on humans managing the outputs, it's not that big a deal, because again, it's not like you have a trading agent that's making thousands of trades a minute based on a certain program. You still have a human who's validating and considering and rebutting, etc.
All right, next, it's going to help you with yours. So what are the tools and TMS systems that do these steps you just suggested? I think that's your own. It's integrated.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what we're doing at BureauWorks. So feel free to check it out. Our solution architecture team is very friendly. We help people get things set up. We're moving very fast in this direction, and we already have tons of things that are available that can help you.
I got one. Actually, I'm loving this feature here with showing the question. So lots of tech, lots of bells and whistles. How do we make it not BureauWorks specifically, but generally industry wide, like the UI more intuitive and efficient for translators? So much tech, like you don't want to get distracted. You want to be the creative writer / translator, work more harmoniously with this. And for you on the product building front, this is like you probably have to make decisions about clutter versus declutter every day.
Yeah, well, we've already made some of those decisions, so that's why we've already begun work on what we call BureauWorks 3.0. But the idea is 100% in the sense that as we move into this paradigm of writing and authorship, the whole idea of a workbench with segments kind of becomes, in my opinion, not the right environment for people to be creative in and iterate on. So yeah, we're definitely talking about a much more fluid, much more minimalistic environment, at least in my opinion. But again, we also want to offer people the choice, because some people are already so used to working in an environment that's feels more cluttered and full of information. We respect that too. So I think but definitely I agree that the trend is towards a completely revisited experience of what it means to work with. So whatever tools were super useful in 2015 aren't the tools that are going to get you to 2030, at least in my opinion, at least how they look like.
Got one more from Edwin. Sounds like you're speaking on an ontological approach to organization. That way a marketing agent can pass on business intel to the CAT tool. Is that how you see it? I'll let you process.
A marketing agent can pass on business intelligence to the CAT tool. Is that how you see it? Yeah, no. Maybe I didn't understand the question, Edwin, but the way that I'm describing it is the agent is there to feed humans, at least in our perspective, with a ton of information, whether it's knowledge and insights, and it's still up to the human to decide. So I don't even like it in this perspective to use the word cat tool, because like we were saying previously, I think we're talking about a different kind of tooling. It's still going to have a lot of the same components in the background, like knowledge management and terminology management and all of that. But the way the relationship works between the user and that knowledge is going to be entirely different. So, and the difference is the user is going to be fed with information, and then based on their reactions, that information is going to be continuously reshaped. And then we're also talking about producing so many more different variants with that information. So I guess in my response to your question is, happy to take it offline as well, but I think it's a dynamic approach. So that would be the short answer.
Got it. All right. Gabriel, as always, thank you so much for taking the time. Thought-provoking presentation, and yeah, great. See you next
Thank you,
time.
Florian. I
You
hope I
enjoy the
lived up
role.
to your initial words and didn't disappoint. And
You
thank you so
did,
much
you
for
did
having me.
not disappoint. Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks,
All
Gabriel.
right.